Hi everyone, so this time I decided to try a bit something new, a bit of a new format, which is a video react respond to what lately YouTube recommends to me in the gaming sphere, so I thought it could be interesting to do that. Anyway, so the video in question I want to review and respond to is this one. Why are modern open world games so damn empty? I haven't fully watched this one, only bits and pieces, in order to know if it's worth responding and reacting to. That being said, there are a couple of red flags I'm seeing here. So first is the thumbnail. We have 3 games in question. Here we have Witcher 3, which is 2015. Then the second game I guess is Star Wars Outlaws something, I'm not entirely sure. And the last one is Assassin's Creed Shadow, which seems to be highlighted. Now keep in mind this game has not been released yet, so yeah, we don't really know how empty this game is going to be. Now the second issue, red flag let's say I have with this one is the title itself. I cannot stop but cringe anytime I see the whole modern gaming this or that thing. It's just nonsense for the most part. First, in terms of video game, it's not very clear when modernity started. Like I find it a bit strange how some people consider games from, I don't know, maybe 2015, maybe even early, like pre-modern or even classics. Moreover, this title implies that pre-modern open world games were not so damn empty, which is totally not the case. If we take a look at games like Oblivion or Morrowind, or even other open world games from those times, they had plenty of empty areas and spaces between locations and points of interest. Don't get me wrong, having empty spaces in an open world is absolutely important, it's very essential, in order to have that feeling of discovery, you know? When you discover something, it's something special. Or at least it should be. That's actually maybe the real issue here. You don't want content to be thrown at you every 15 seconds or 20 seconds. So a certain amount of empty space, it's absolutely necessary, and it's going to vary from game to game. That being said, I think we should start watching the video and see what's all about.
I'm a big fan of open world games, and I remember when I first launched The Witcher 3 almost 10 years ago, playing it at a very low frame rate. And no, the Nintendo Switch hadn't been released yet, I just didn't have a powerful PC. But despite the numerous bugs and low FPS, I was fascinated by this game, and all because of an incredible open world that I hadn't seen in any previous game. But what's worse, I won't see it in almost every game that follows. Since the release of The Witcher 3, we've seen dozens of other big open world projects. Some of them were quite good.
Okay, so let's pause it for a second. He mentions here Witcher 3. Now, I'm not really sure when was the last time he played that game, because I can tell you for all its merits, such as the story and interesting characters, the open world wasn't one of them. I mean, yeah, sure, it looked very pretty and it still does, don't get me wrong, but the open world was just, I'm sorry to say, Ubisoft. That was it. For the most part, was Ubisoft type of content. Essentially, you had a few types of activities sprinkled and copy-pasted all across the map, such as hidden treasure, guarded treasure, bandits camp. Hell, they even ripped off some of the camp liberation type of activity you find in a Far Cry game. However, unlike a Ubisoft game, where at least you can choose how to approach some of these activities, like stealth, gun blazing, or maybe create chaos in all sorts of ways, in Witcher 3 your options are extremely limited. You just jump into the battle and just kill everyone, that's it. And this type of open world design was rather popular, and still is. I mean, you have Days Gone, Spider-Man, Horizon games, Ghost of Tsushima, pretty much all of them follow the same formula more or less.
And we'll talk about them today, but most of the games were just bad. The game worlds not only remained the same as they were 10 or even 15 years ago, but they degraded. But why? Why did the big game studios that once created new standards for open world games just start creating big maps that made no sense? Why is it that when you play a new Assassin's Creed, Outlaws, Starfield, or almost every new game, you get bored in the beginning and you just force yourself to play on because you just bought this shit? And this feeling is very different from when you were a kid and you were enthusiastic about exploring the world of Skyrim or the third Fallout.
Maybe the reason why things felt different and magical, and we had maybe a different enthusiasm for these types of open world games, maybe has to do a lot with the fact we were just kids back then, and we didn't have much else going on than just play games and be kids. Now, this of course, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy things to the same degree or have the same enthusiasm, but it's very important to take into account when talking about games you enjoy when you were a kid, how nostalgia can influence how you view those games.
In fact, the degradation of modern open worlds is not due to the greed of large corporations that just want to make a new game quickly to make money. It's also not because modern developers are lazy or incompetent enough because they were hired through the DEI program rather than because of their professional qualifications.
Oh god, it's one of those channels with buzzwords like DEI and woke. Oh, fuck. I also find hilarious the passive-aggressive tone where he calls developers lazy or incompetent. Indeed, very subtle.
In fact, most open world games have degraded so much because game studios, for whatever reason, started making three fundamental mistakes. These problems have started to occur more and more often in the game industry, which personally makes me very worried about the future of open world games. And the first reason is the lack of a meaningful story. The third Witcher had something I hadn't seen in any open world game before. Its entire huge map was filled with deep side quests that developed the plot and the world. Every corner of the open world had its own story, atmosphere, and unique characters. This created the feeling that the vast expanses of the continent were not just very beautiful, but also important and alive.
Yes, indeed, Witcher 3 had plenty of interesting side quests, that is true. But let's not pretend the game doesn't suffer from the same issues other games do. I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but a lot of its open world was just that, filler.
But now, we see how Ubisoft can still create a beautiful landscape, but this beautiful picture is devoid of any emotional connection with the player. Why should I give a fuck about beautifully drawn trees if there's nothing to do between those trees? Or the beautiful and detailed landscapes, if I'm forced to do the same thing for the whole game for dozens of hours, which often has nothing to do with the main story?
Honestly, I have no freaking idea what he's talking about, since he's not very specific at all. I mean, if he's talking about Valhalla, most of the side activities you encounter as you explore are optional, so you're not really forced to do anything. Moreover, the things he said about Witcher 3 and the fact that each corner of the world has its own story with unique atmosphere and unique characters, well, this also applies to the Assassin's Creed open world trilogy. On top of that, the side activities you find in these games are way more interesting and varied than all the question marks you have in Witcher 3. And sure, you might not enjoy all of them to the same extent, but I think you have to be very ignorant to brush under the rug everything these games have to offer.
And the story itself is often created just to be there. Previously, we used to play good story-driven games with an open world as a bonus. Now we play an open world that just tries to keep us engaged for more hours, where the bonus is a template plot that no one gives a shit about.
Okay, so those story-driven games where the open world is like a bonus, well, it's not an accident that the open world is also kind of boring, without interesting stuff to discover and activities to do and stuff like that. This might sound like a hot take, I don't know, but if you're making an open world, shouldn't it be like a priority to make that open world interesting as possible to explore with interesting landmarks and locations and activities and stuff to do, and not just a bonus that you get for the main story?
For this genre of games, a good story, both main and side stories must not be just good, but very good. If a new Call of Duty or other game with linear levels has an average story, it won't be a big deal. But in games that intend to engage us for 50 or even 70 hours, you have to give us a story that will grab us and keep us engaged, and not collecting the same collectibles or destroying the same outposts. Unfortunately, this is a big problem for modern open world games. Weak, superficial story, or its almost complete absence. The story is the foundation that unites all the elements of the game, gives it meaning, and motivates the player to explore the world. In the past, games like The Witcher 3 or RDR2 offered players deep, multi-layered stories that affected emotions and created a connection with the characters.
So yeah, I completely disagree with all this. And honestly, I think he got everything backwards. If you have a linear campaign, well, you have no other options but to follow it. That's why the main story in those types of games should be really important. Moreover, linear games tend to have also better pacing, since you're not really distracted with all sorts of activities and side quests and exploration. Now, in an open world game, if you really don't like the main story that much, that it's not really that much of a problem, since you have plenty of side quests and other activities and exploration to do. One of the most praised and celebrated open world games we've seen lately is Elden Ring. I'm curious how many people play that game for the story or for the deep characters. While all these things exist to an extent, they are not really the focus here. They are rather more paper thin. The emphasis seems to be the lore rather than the plot. And yet I was still very much compelled to explore for a significant amount of time. And the reason is that From Software managed to create an interesting and compelling open world to explore, which has absolutely nothing to do with the main story. I'm not saying an open world game doesn't need a good story. At the end of the day, all games need one. But I really fail to see how a good story would motivate anyone to explore, especially if there isn't anything interesting to discover.
We see how developers often sacrifice stories for the sake of scale. A huge world filled with question marks on a map cannot compensate for the lack of a quality story.
Actually, I would like to turn this around and say this: a good story, no matter how great it is, does not compensate for the lack of an interesting open world to explore. Witcher 3 is a great example here, at least for me. Much as I like the main story and even a lot of the side quests, the open world exploration and side activities and other stuff was at the end of the day rather disappointing, filled with tons of question marks. He claims he doesn't like Ubisoft games, and yet he doesn't have any issue here with Witcher 3.
Once upon a time, Ubisoft was one of those who laid the foundations for this genre. This company was the one that knew how to combine a good adult story with an open world. Even before going bankrupt, Ubisoft had so many good and financially successful franchises that it could easily have become the new Rockstar. But it didn't.
For as much as this guy talks about Ubisoft, he doesn't really know much about the history of Ubisoft. First of all, they did not lay the foundation of the open world genre. Some of the most important titles that actually did that was the GTA series, some of the Zelda games, which is still debatable how open they actually were before Breath of the Wild, and then of course you have the Elder Scrolls series. And sure, you can go even further than that in the 80s or 70s. But these games, I think, were very influential at the time. Actually, Ubisoft started going open world mostly with Assassin's Creed 1, which, don't get me wrong, it was a remarkable achievement, especially the parkour and the traversal aspect, but at the same time the open world itself and the stuff you can do in that world, well, it's kind of boring and repetitive at the same time, with a handful of activities copy-pasted all across the map, and this design choice is also present in many games that followed. As for Far Cry games, they actually developed the series from Far Cry 2, which borrowed certain things from the Assassin's Creed series while mixing things up with various sandbox elements, and for a while actually it did work very well. The open world of Far Cry 3 was a massive improvement over the second one, which had extremely boring and repetitive activities. And I know Far Cry 2 has more realism and more details, but ultimately the gameplay loop of Far Cry 3 it's way more engaging and dynamic. That being said, Ubisoft formula proved to be very influential. As I said, the open world of Witcher 3 is very much the product of those influences, among dozens of other games that came out since then.
The latest games in their Assassin's Creed and Far Cry series are just shameful imitations of their franchises. Behind the slight improvements in graphics, we see a massive degradation in the story.
It's funny how he talks about the massive degradation in the story, and yet he shows physics details, and explosions and particles and stuff like that. Now, when it comes to the so-called massive degradation of the story in the latest Assassin's Creed games or Far Cry, that's just straight up bullshit. Things are way more complicated and nuanced than that. I will not say it's a degradation by any means, it's more like a hit and miss. Let's not pretend like some of the old Assassin's Creed games didn't have plenty of issues, and the story was mediocre for many of them.
Valhalla has the most boring story in the history of the entire franchise, and at the same time, it is the longest game in the entire Assassin's Creed series. For more than 100 hours, you have to walk around a huge world in which the main story simply dissolves into endless quests of the same type.
What the hell is this guy talking about? It doesn't take over 100 hours to be the main story, but rather around 60, which is rather close, you know, to many other open world titles.
A weak story and a lot of unnecessary icons on the map make the game boring as hell. Without a clear motivation or emotional involvement, every quest and every location seems empty, even if they are technically filled with content. And this is not just my words full of hatred for Ubisoft, it's simple statistics. More than 40% of Assassin's Creed's Valhalla players didn't even reach England and quit the game right after the prologue. That's 4 fucking hours of game. 4 out of more than 100 hours that thousands of developers have been working on for several years, and which turned out to be useless to anyone.
Why do I get the feeling this guy hasn't even played a game he likes to critique? Like, the purpose in Valhalla is to establish a new clan in England while conquering a new land and also establishing and making new alliances. Hell, even the overall structure of the game leans very much into that. As for the story being boring and all that, I mean, it's mostly jibber-jabber word salad, so there's not much to work with that. That being said, he does throw some interesting numbers, such as Valhalla being the longest Assassin's Creed game, therefore this is bad somehow. Now, if we put these numbers into a larger context, we might see some interesting stuff here. First of all, yes, this might be the longest Assassin's Creed game, but mostly when it comes to the main story. In order to complete everything the game has to offer, well, if we compare these numbers with Odyssey, we can clearly see they are very close to each other. Moreover, if we compare these numbers with other titles, such as Elden Ring or Red Dead Redemption or Witcher 3, we can see there isn't such a big difference and gap between them. So I find it very interesting how these numbers are mostly used to attack Valhalla and how long it is, while completely disregarding and ignoring other games, which on average are pretty much in the same boat. Okay, so now let's move to the next numbers he loves to throw around. First of all, the time it takes to complete Norway world can vary from 4 hours to 10 hours, or maybe even more. It's all up to you how much exploration you want to do, since there are plenty of things to discover. As for the 40% of players who do not get to England, so this is what a lie by omission looks like. First of all, these stats were measured on Xbox Game Pass, so it doesn't fully represent all the players who played on different platforms. On True Achievement, we see that around 74% of players actually got to England. Moreover, these numbers are not that unusual as one might think. If we look at other games such as Red Dead Redemption 2, only 42% of players actually completed Chapter 2. In Witcher 3, only 22% of players completed the main story. On True Achievement, it's a bit higher, but still rather low. So much so for the main story, which apparently is so important for an open world, when most people didn't even bother with that and decided to do something else.
And this happens not only with Assassin's Creed. A quarter of Starfield players couldn't even complete the first mission, even though it's only the first 30 minutes of the game. And only 17% of players completed the first part of the main story of Star Wars Outlaws. Although I don't think that's a lot, considering that 17% of everyone who bought this game is also about 17 people. But still.
All these numbers that he throws around need context, which of course he doesn't provide. For example, how many people completed the tutorial section on Starfield varies from Game Pass to Steam, which is higher. Not to mention, on True Achievement it's even higher. Moreover, these numbers are not that surprising when you compare them to other games. How many people continued the main story after finishing the prologue in Witcher 3? On Steam it's only 62, but on True Achievement it's much higher. On Red Dead Redemption 2 we also have some interesting numbers to see. On Steam almost 30% of people do not finish the prologue without even getting to the big open world to explore. So what Radical Cap does here is to cherry-pick informations and data without providing any context in order to create a specific narrative about the modern gaming. The point I'm trying to get to is that all of this is nonsense and extremely dishonest at the same time.
We see that compared to old games that are replayed from time to time, new games from the same developers become uninteresting for most people at the beginning of the story because of its superficiality and general shitty nature. Stories, both main and side, in modern open world games suck. And why is that? It's pretty damn simple. It's the desire of big publishers to reach a wider audience. Developers create worlds that are aimed at everyone, avoiding complex or risky plots that could lose some players.
Of course, we have the appeal to the wider audience fallacy. Which doesn't mean anything, it's just empty words. I mean, he doesn't provide any specifics, it's more like, I really don't like when developers make games for other people too and they try to include everyone, whatever that means, instead of appealing to my high IQ intellect. If we look at some of the most successful open world games we've seen in the past years, we can clearly see they had a very wide appeal, even for people who don't really play games that often. For example, Baldur's Gate 3, you can kind of say that game appeals to the wider audience. I mean, it's a very accessible and customizable game and anyone can play it. Other games that do have a very mainstream appeal, and yes, they appeal to a wider audience, are Red Dead Redemption 2, Witcher 3, Skyrim. Hell, you can even make this argument for Elden Ring to an extent. I'm sorry From Software fanboys, but you can't be hipsters anymore. Souls games that used to be very niche, nowadays they just became mainstream. Now, there was a time when the whole appeal to the wider audience fallacy was used against certain games which were perceived as not having enough depth, or maybe being too easy and not difficult enough. However, now we see games that do have more depth and embrace way more being hard and difficult while still having this mainstream and wider appeal. And lastly, it's kind of difficult to tell when changes were made to a certain game. They were made as part of this appeal to a wider audience and not part of the initial vision. I mean, at the end of the day, the wider audience nowadays plays Elden Ring, Souls games and Baldur's Gate 3. Now let's jump a bit forward to the next section, which I'm a bit more interested in.
Another fundamental problem is the lack of interactivity, which makes the world alive and, to some extent, realistic. Now I will ask you about something that is very difficult for a person who loves video games. Think about what
surrounds you when you go out. No matter how long ago it was, try to remember the sounds, smells, people, and cars. Hundreds of thousands of details surround us in the real world, and you can interact with all these details. Everything has a meaning. Now,
look at what open worlds in video games often try to surprise us with. The same thing porn actors do, with a large size. But why do we need a large size if there's nothing to do there? Developers, such as the fucking Ubisoft, often fill their words with a lot of secondary content, useless collectibles, outposts, and meaningless quests that just repeat throughout the game. But
first of all of these things he mentioned here were pretty much present in the older titles, actually to a much larger extent. Not to mention a lot of these critiques also apply to Witcher fucking 3, which has exactly the same issues. You can barely talk and interact with anybody. Not to mention the open world was rather filled with tons of copy-paste and repetitive activities and filler. As for meaningless side quests, well, I disagree with that. I do think, especially since Origins and Odyssey, there are plenty of interesting side quests, with plenty of choices to make as well.
Even though we have to spend dozens of hours on useless grind, it doesn't change anything in the game world. Just remember what interactivity looks like in Rockstar games, and it's important to understand that I'm not talking about side quests here. In RDR2, we had main story quests and side story quests for characters that stretched for over several separate missions, creating separate story arcs. But in addition to all of this, we also had random events that had nothing to do with either the main story or the side storylines. And these small and random stories were also a great way to make the open world more alive. Every time you rode your horse from one mission to the next, you would encounter some motherfuckers who wanted to rob you, or who were just going about their business that affected you and the game world.
That I agree actually, the open world was and still is very much alive and feels alive, and the world events and random encounters definitely help with that, making the open world way more dynamic and interesting. But again, Ubisoft does have some of these things as well. For example, the Far Cry series, especially since Far Cry 3, is filled with random encounters and fights between other factions. Hell, you even see them interacting with the wildlife. Moreover, Assassin's Creed Valhalla has dozens upon dozens of world events. True, they are not random, but still serve a very similar purpose to the stories you encounter in Red Dead Redemption 2. But speaking of random encounters, in Valhalla you have zealots roaming around or various bandits groups, and in Odyssey as well you have bounty hunters that will chase you down depending on how many crimes you committed. And not to mention, in Origins you can see other predators hunting other animals or even people. And don't even get me started on Watch Dogs 2, which has an insane amount of details and random encounters.
And these small and random stories were also a great way to make the open world more alive. Every time you rode your horse from one mission to the next, you would encounter some motherfuckers who wanted to rob you, or who were just going about their business that affected you and the game world. NPCs behaved as if they were living their own lives independently of the player. And the main thing is that the game allows you to interact with it. That's why most open world games feel empty and predictable, even though they're filled with NPCs or all sorts of unnecessary activities. It all feels static, patterned, and just repetitive. And that's really a shame, because Watch Dogs Legion, Avatar, and even Assassin's Creed Mirage show that Ubisoft is not that crooked yet, because the worlds in these games look pretty good. But the beauty of the world is not supported by anything. It's like pouring water into a Coke can. Yes, now the water looks good, but no one wants to drink this shit.
As I said, many of these things can be found in many Ubisoft games as well, to varying degree. While Red Dead Redemption 2 is filled with tons of NPCs you can interact with, and they all seem to have their own life and schedule and stuff like that, all of these things can be found on other games but on a smaller scale. For example, you have the Elder Scrolls Fallout series or Kingdom Come Deliverance. Look, don't get me wrong, I want more interaction in open world games, and I want more developers to make that more of a priority rather than how big the map is. That being said, it's also very important to take into account how big actually Rockstar is, considering that over 2,000 people worked on Red Dead Redemption 2. So I wouldn't expect every developer to have exactly the same amount of details in their games. And yes, even in the AAA sphere, it's very important to add perspective. It's one thing to have 500 people work on a game, or even 600, versus having 2,000, or 4,000, or God knows how many people worked on GTA 6.
Another problem is that Ubisoft's game development model has somehow become the standard for the industry. Other studios started adding similar mechanics to their games. This can be seen in Horizon Zero Dawn or Cyberpunk 2077, where most of the activities seem to be content for content's sake. A lot of question marks, but do you really need them?
Indeed, it's rather disappointing how many open-world games nowadays adopted this Ubisoft-ish way of filling the map with busy work, which oftentimes is not even as fun as in the average Ubisoft game. That being said, Cyberpunk 2077 had way more interesting side activities than Witcher 3 had. Actually, some of them had self-contained stories with interesting NPCs to interact with, or environmental storytelling. And sure, when the game was released, it just threw all the markers all at once on the map, but since then, they improved and changed a lot of things. Okay, so for the next part of the video, I want to sum it up a bit here. I don't want to stretch this video unnecessarily, so you can watch the whole thing yourself if you want to. That being said, there are a few things where I kind of agree. For example, the open world of many games being unnecessarily big and not enough content to fill it up with, that is true. Or yes, the lack of interaction, it's another issue. Or even how many open world games nowadays adopt this Ubisoft-ish way of adding content to the world. I also agree that not all games need to make this transition to big open world, which seems to be the trend nowadays with more and more titles. And here he offers the Mafia example, which I kind of agree. But one of my biggest gripes and issues I have with this video and similar videos like this is how selective and inconsistent their critiques are. For example, this guy likes Witcher 3 and Ghost of Tsushima, and yet those games pretty much follow the footsteps of many Ubisoft type of open world titles he claims he doesn't like. Moreover, the whole open worlds have gotten too big and not enough content to fill it up with. Well, that could easily apply to Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Elden Ring as well. So a lot of the criticism you can levy against Ubisoft, which many of them can be true, don't get me wrong, can easily be applied to other games. But again, we see a lot of biases and how selective people are with that. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.